This is a review of the 1956 Vincente Minnelli film Tea and Sympathy, which stars Deborah Kerr. This movie's in color, so you can see her red hair if you've only seen Deborah Kerr in From Here to Eternity. Maybe you aren't even aware that she had famously red hair. Trade publications at the time would have told you about this, would have told fans about it, and you'd see it on the posters. But I remember when I first became aware of her, I had no idea until I watched An Affair to Remember, I think, first color movie I saw her in. Anyway, it also stars John Kerr, who is not related. John Kerr is a very sort of East Coasty theatrical actor, went to Exeter and Harvard, and then worked at the Brattle Theater, quite near Harvard in Boston. In Cambridge, which is a legendary movie theater where Janus Films was founded and operates out of. It also stars an actor named Leif Erikson, but not that Leif Erikson. And Dean Jones appears in a small role. I mentioned this because a few weeks ago on this channel, I reviewed The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit and The Horse in the Gray Flannel Suit. Dean Jones starred in The Horse in the Gray Flannel Suit, and I remember mentioning that I had no idea who he was. Well, now I have slightly more of an idea who he is, although it's not a major role in this movie. Like I said, this movie was directed by Vincente Minnelli. We'll come back to him, but he's an interesting guy. And the reason I came to this film is because it was written by Robert Anderson. At least it's based on a play written by Robert Anderson. Many of these works many movies that are based on Robert Anderson sort of plays don't have additional credits for the screenplay. This is one of those. So I'm not sure if that means that he was directly involved with the making of the movie, or if they just took the play and the work that was done to convert to the screen was not substantial enough for someone to be credited. I don't know exactly, but it's somewhat common with his work. I've reviewed 2 Robert Anderson movies on this channel already. One is The Sand Pebbles, and the other is I Never Sang for My Father. Those are both phenomenal movies, and Robert Anderson also wrote the screenplay for one of my all-time favorite movies, top 2, basically, which is a movie called The Nun Story from 1959, starring Audrey Hepburn and Peter Finch. I'm not sure if I will review that on this channel because it's an incredibly complex movie that has a deep personal connection, so it would take a long time for me to sort out the details on that, but maybe someday I will. All 4 of these movies fit into the genre of psychological realism, which is what Robert Anderson was all about. I'll talk about more of his hallmarks and virtues as we go on, but one thing that just comes to mind every time I think about these movies is just how sort of nice it is, it seems to me at least, for there to have been mature films in the mainstream, mature adult movies about complex subjects that don't pull any punches. As big mainstream films with big actors in them that a lot of people saw. I think one misconception sometimes when people watch this channel or talk to me about movies is that they think of these movies as all being very obscure. And in a sense, that's right, because these movies nobody really knows that much about these movies these days. But when these movies were released and such, they were not obscure. They have big actors, and a lot of people saw them. Like I said, The Nun Story, for instance, when it came out, it was a huge box office success, and it was regarded at the time as Audrey Hepburn's most financially successful movie. So again, you might think, oh, but these are sort of specialty connoisseur films or something, but in fact, these were movies that a lot of people went to see at the time. Now, of course, Audrey Hepburn's biggest hits would come later, but still, she would have been in things like Roman Holiday and Sabrina predated The Nun Story, and The Nun Story apparently eclipsed them in financial success, which is almost the opposite of what you would expect, with those movies being sort of lighter, more sort of entertaining, superficial fare, and The Nun Story being a hugely introspective and thoughtful movie. Like I said, mature films in the mainstream were a thing. It's not to say that things are totally barren now, but it is a big change in the industry from the past to now. So what is this movie, Tea and Sympathy, actually about? I figure I should talk about that some. On the surface, the story is somewhat straightforward. It's set at some kind of a boarding school, maybe a bit like Exeter, and it centers around a character named Tom Lee. This is John Kerr's character, who doesn't really fit in with the rest of the boys at the school. He enjoys gardening, for instance, and singing and cooking, and spending time with the faculty wives, and in particular, one of the faculty wives, which is played by Deborah Kerr, and who is the wife of some sort of athletics coach person who the athletics coach sort of spends all of his time with the boys, and she's sort of in their little house tending to things, and Tom ends up spending a lot of time with her. The other boys basically take personal offense at Tom Lee being a bit different. They call him Sister Boy, for instance, and find many innovative ways to bully and exclude him and such. In the play, there are explicit accusations of homosexuality lodged towards Tom Lee. This is not included in the movie because the production code did not allow that. Not because the production code didn't want you to bully people for being gay, but because it didn't want to talk about homosexuality at all, was just not a thing. And so the movie has to sort of work around that. But it's still basically the similar kind of story. Here we maybe turn to Vincente Minnelli, who's the director of the movie. He was married to 4 different women, but widely assumed to be gay. An interesting piece of trivia is that his daughter, Liza Minnelli, right? So Vincente Minnelli was married to Judy Garland at one point, and their daughter, Liza Minnelli, her first husband was also gay, which is kind of an interesting piece of trivia. But the point is that Vincente Minnelli may have had a personal interest and stake in this movie, and I think that could be telling. Minnelli's kind of interesting. He had a very successful Hollywood career, won or was at least nominated for 2 Academy Awards for, I think Gigi and An American in Paris. He made a lot of big sort of melodramatic 50s films, a lot of musicals and such. And this movie has some of the trappings of that, but is really a different kind of thing. Their homosexuality in classic Hollywood is a very, very interesting topic for another video, maybe, or for someone else to talk about who knows more about it. There were, in Hollywood, in the classical era, there were gay actors, directors, and all kinds of executives and people throughout the industry. And to some extent, they found a place. That's not to say that it was good, but it's complicated sort of situation. But like I said, interesting topic for another video. The story is also somewhat autobiographical regarding Robert Anderson. He also went to some sort of boarding school and was very lonely and had some sort of relationship with someone like Deborah Kerr, basically. Robert Anderson was married to Teresa Wright and another woman. I don't know if he was straight, but he was at least married. This ends the gossip section of the film, though. This is interesting context, but I don't think it's particularly important for understanding the movie. What is the movie really about? Well, a couple of different things. For one, machismo. This is a vivid and a compelling depiction of the sort of mechanisms of masculinity, right? How is it? Why is it that there should be this thing, masculinity, maleness, or whatever, that is sort of seemingly universal, at least in some places, selectively universal, I guess. This established sort of institution of masculinity. What the heck is that? How does it spread? How is it created? This movie will give you some examples of some of the mechanisms behind it. For the most part, it's about teenage boys. You can imagine them being sort of rowdy and such, and having sort of very strong tribal tendencies or something along those lines, wanting everyone to be the same, not being able to handle outsiders and things like that, having a rigidity in their sort of informal social systems and such. But the movie is also about adults, such as this coach, Deborah Kerr's husband and such, who plays a role in this. And so the system is formalized. Also the father. The system is sort of formalized beyond just sort of the haphazard rituals of teens, but it's actually sort of encoded into the traditions of the school and the society and families and all these things. This movie really brings that to the fore in a compelling way, partly by showing the cruelty of all of this. And so this movie is also, to a large extent, about being an outsider. This is just one really, really great scene. In the movie, there's Tom Lee is a tennis player, so he sort of hangs out with a lot of the athletes, or he's associated with them, but he doesn't spend any time with them because he's not into sort of the hypermasculine scene and such. He plays tennis. They accuse him of playing tennis basically like a girl. He puts spin on the ball rather than just smashing it as hard as he can and such. And so nobody really supports him. But there's a scene where his father comes. There's a great, great transition that starts this scene, which is just such a nice 1950s sort of moment. or classic Hollywood sort of moment where there's Tom Lee has a picture of his father in his room that is at one point sort of vandalized by one of the other kids. They sort of come into his room. They want to look at his window to ogle some girls through binoculars, which is pretty subtle. And when they're leaving, one of them says, "Hey, is this your pops?" And he puts like shaving cream onto the picture. And his roommate wipes it off, and you see a close-up of the picture, and then it cuts to the father, which is a really nice transition to just instantly we know who this guy is and what he's doing and such. They mentioned sort of earlier that he's coming to watch the match or something along those lines. Anyway, so here he is watching the match, and the father shows up, and it quickly becomes clear whose side the crowd is on, right? So when Tom scores a point, it's silent. When the other guy scores a point, there's cheering and such. This alienates the father. Tom seems sort of used to it, but complicated. Like I said, a compelling story about being an outsider. There are scenes like this. This is basically the vibe of the entire movie. And it is sort of a gut-wrenching movie in a lot of ways. So machismo being an outsider, this movie is also a movie, surely, about being gay. Like I said, they take sort of a different, there's some, they have to sort of obscure the sort of any obvious references to homosexuality in the movie, or particular terms and words. And there is another plot in the movie that sort of takes the place, maybe, of explicitly homosexual content or something like that. And in some ways, that sends the movie a little bit sideways. And if you're thinking that this is like some super subversive movie or something, well, just be aware of the time and the place when this was made and such, and the restrictions with the production code and such. But like I said, surely these two things in the beginning are also very closely related to this being a movie about being gay. This is a 50s movie, and it is a mellow drama. So like I said, if you're hoping for some super subversive movie, this is not it. Not only is there the production code that sort of delegates or dictates sort of the laws of the land, but there's also just the tradition of cinema at the time and the norms and such. Vincente Minnelli was a mainstream director who made a ton of big movies and such, but who also made this movie. So, you know, this is a melodrama, but there are some things to push on that. For one thing, there's actually not that much music in this movie, or more specifically, most of the music that is in this movie is incidental music. So it happens sort of in transitions, and it doesn't happen very much during conversations themselves. A lot of the scenes that have people going back and forth, and there are a lot of extremely good sort of theatrical scenes in this movie that are just sort of talking. Very few of them have music while during the dialogue, which I really, really appreciate, because this is one of the sort of hallmarks of 50s movies, is the sort of over-the-top strings all the time. But this actually has, I think, a fairly tasteful score that's really only used sort of at the end of scenes or at the beginning and such, which goes a long way. And in general here, there's just this general theme of, yes, this is sort of a melodrama, but not entirely, or there's some differences or something. It's a non-standard. There are over-the-top characters in this movie. For instance, all the you know, boys and such, the athletes horsing around and things, and excluding and bullying Tom and such, are fairly over-the-top characters, but there are also complex characters in this movie, particularly Al, who is Tom's roommate, who's sort of caught between Tom and all the other boys, and his own family and such, and the coach and all these things. Very interesting character. The character of Herb, who's the dad, interesting character. The character of Ellie, who is sort of the waitress at the soda fountain, very interesting, which is another time where you see the machismo in full bloom. Well, she's another fairly interesting character. And I think the movie actually does a pretty good job of balancing sort of fairly extreme 50s like characters that are pretty over the top with a lot of more subtle and interesting moments. There's also a lot of clever moments in the movie. I don't really want to spoil these, but it's not exactly the movie has twists or something, but for a lot of movies, for a lot of sort of newer movies that are going to be sort of social dramas or something along those lines, you're not going to find like sort of clever or like classical moments in them where, oh, look, like, well, yeah, I don't want to spoil them, but there are some clever moments is the point. Theatricality is a big part of this movie. I mentioned already there's a number of just great scenes that you kind of sense like, oh, this is sort of from the play. This does not suffer from sort of play syndrome at all. It doesn't feel like oh, like this is just obviously an adaptation. It doesn't feel like it's all filmed in the same room. It feels like there's a big world out there, and it's expansive, and it uses that really well. So this is a really solid adaptation. But there are also a couple of scenes where you just think, dang, like these are two actors really going at it. And I think the scene that sort of best, one of the scenes that sort of best talks about this is a scene where Al, Tom's roommate, talks to Tom, and I won't go into this too much because it's a bit later in the movie, but one of the things he talks about is how Tom might consider altering the way that he walks, and they both go back and forth experimenting with the way that they walk. There's also a sort of clever hook to end this scene and sort of wrap it up in a bow that calls back to that sort of, classic Hollywood, sort of just classic, clever little twists. There's a great one to end this scene, which is overall just a phenomenal scene. Another thing that's kind of nice about the movie is, in general, cinematography is pretty good. There's a couple of interesting sort of non-standard camera angles at times, a little bit more on, not handheld exactly, but they break sort of the, just very standard tripod shots kind of thing a couple of times. There's some really nice ensemble staging in this movie as well, particularly there's a great scene early on where the are out on, the fellows, as they call them, are out on the beach, and they've got some magazine that has a quiz about how macho you are and such. They're doing word associations and things like that. And this is at one point when the subject turns to Tom Lee, and they discuss what might be wrong with him. I think that one of the main virtues of this movie, and really the main virtue in all four of the Robert Anderson movies that I mentioned earlier, is uncertainty. Uncertainty is a tricky thing to show, and I would say in both my reviews of The Sand Pebbles and my review of I Never Sang for My Father, I talk about uncertainty. I think I do a good job of conveying how it appears in those movies, and I don't want to recover all of that same territory, but the point is that this movie is not exactly how I described it in reality, right? Yeah, it is about a kid being bullied and such, who doesn't have friends, who doesn't have sympathy, and such. But at the same time, there are interesting moments from other characters. For instance, Al, his roommate, is a hugely uncertain character, really does not know what to do, does not know if he should follow the crowd, does not know if he should sort of stick up for this kind of friend that he has, doesn't know how to handle his father. Also, Tom himself doesn't really know what to make of things. When they talk about the walking, for instance, he's interested in learning how to change his walk. He's not proudly defiant by any means. He is uncertain. Then you've got Deborah Kerr, who is in some way sort of a moral engine in this movie, and at times borders on slightly too didactic, but more or less we survive. She's also uncertain about what to do about this, and whether or not to intervene, how she could intervene, if she should, and such. And one of the things that's really, I think, sums up this sort of uncertainty as a virtue in these movies, is that it's very common to find uncertainty in a movie as a plot device, as in the middle of the movie when the characters are facing conflict, they're uncertain about how it should be resolved. Yes, that's how movies work. That's how very basic dramatic plots function. But one thing that you'll find a lot in Robert Anderson movies is that at the end of the movie, once things have played out, characters are uncertain about how they went. They're not sure if they did the right things. They're not sure if they made the right choices. They're not sure how it's going to matter, how it will impact them, how it will impact others, how it will shape, lives. And that is much, much more rare. Like I said, it's the main virtue. And this movie absolutely has that. In fact, it explicitly talks about this at the end of the movie. So would I recommend this movie? Well, yes. Obviously, this is really my kind of movie, with a sort of complex social realism, with very strong characters, and unflinching realism. But I'm not 100% sure how a modern audience would react to this. Like I said, there are far more subversive movies now. And so, for instance, if you're watching this film from out of an LGBTQ interest, for instance, and you're looking for revolutionary or subversive movies or something like that, well, this is subversive for its time. It's very different. It's unique for its time, but it ain't subversive compared to more recent things. And like I said, there is a plot that is, the movie has to sort of swerve away from those ideas in a number of places, and a plot kind of emerges that is interesting, kind of unexpected, and that honestly, I'm not sure. I really don't know how a modern audience would feel about this plot, either an audience who goes into this expecting this to be a movie about homosexuality, where there's sort of a plot line that kind of pulls away from that to some extent, or audiences who are just going to watch an interesting movie. The plot line that it pulls to is kind of, it's interesting, and people might find it a little bit odd. This is an unconventional movie, is what sums it up. And I think to finish off, I'd return to something that I said when talking about the men in the gray flannel suit, which is that it's very easy for people to assume that all of the melodramatic movies of the 1950s are kind of the same, that they're all this sort of American nationalism, heavy-handed kind of thing. And that's not true at all. For one, it's not true because a lot of even the most heavy-handed movies have a lot of interesting undercurrents lurking in them. But it's also not true because there are a lot of interesting movies from the 50s, like this one, that really take a different spin on things. And man, when you watch this, I just felt so thankful that this movie ended up being made, that events conspired such that, Robert Anderson wrote the play, Vincente Minnelli wanted to make the movie, and he found a way, or some producer found a way to actually make this happen. That's really cool. And again, it harkens back to a different kind of time when mature movies were in the mainstream. So overall, I do recommend Tea and Sympathy, directed by Vincente Minnelli from 1956.